Hi, in this video I'm going to explain to you what spring beans are, what their scope is, where you would use them in the real world, and then we'll do some coding examples so that you know how to configure them. So this video is part of a course on web development with Spring Boot, and we are going to explore all of the items that you see here in the index. So right now we're in section 3, which is about spring beans. But if you see anything else on this page, then make sure that you subscribe so that you come back and learn the whole stack. My name is Shad Sluter, and my job is to make you a software developer. That's what I do for a living. I'm a professor of computer science and software development at Grand Canyon University. Many of my students in the class have gotten good jobs here in Phoenix and across the country, where they are now software developers and architects. So you're welcome to come to class with us and learn along. So let's talk first of all about the concept of a bean in Spring Boot. Now a bean is nothing more than just a Java class. So you've worked with object-oriented programming before, you know what a bean is. The only difference is that in Spring Boot, we put annotations on many of the things that are written, including the name of a class. And so this top left corner up here refers to a bunch of objects that are treated specially by Spring. So let me give you a specific example of what a bean would look like. Let's say we have a really simple program, one that is a calculator. And you can see that we do, in this URL, we do an add. And then the answer to 2 plus 2 is actually 4. Now how do we program that? Well, here is the first page that we would encounter. This is the time leaf page. You can see that we have two different items put into the template. One called operation, another called the answer. And so this has to come from somewhere. We're going to provide this through a bean. So here is the calculator program. So this is a class in the program called calculator, and it has two methods, one called add, one called subtract. And you can probably guess what they do. Now, what do we do when we want to use this in a controller? So here's an example what you would do if you were just doing standard Java programming with no beans or dependency injection or anything like that. Look at line 12. This is where our attention is right now. So on line 12, we want to use the calculator class. And so we just make a new instance of it. But we're trying to avoid that because that creates a tight dependency between classes. So even though this is code that works, it's not the one we want to implement. What we want to change is one detail. So compare. Can you see the differences between these two classes? What's changed? If you looked at line 5, you can see that there's been an annotation called a component. Now a spring bean is a class with a special annotation on it. That means it's going to be managed by the Spring container. So the container is really the context of the application. That means that the program is keeping track of all of these beans that have an annotation on them, and it can inject them into another part of the application. So let's take a look where we would do that. Because this says component on it, we can change the controller to look like this version. Now once again, look at the one in the background and compare it to the foreground. Have you seen any changes? If you noticed on line 13, you're correct. It says auto-wired. So when we talk about beans, it means that we are taking some class, like the calculator, and inserting it into another class using dependency injection, or you might call it auto-wired, because that's the annotation that's used here in Spring Boot. So that is what we refer to as a bean. So take a look at some common bean annotations. You've probably seen these by now since we've been through several tutorials. A controller is a bean, a REST controller, a service, a component, a bean, a repository. These are all different ways to identify a bean. And now we have the auto-wired on the right side, which is how we inject a bean into another class. Now remember, the goal of this video is to talk about the scope of a bean. What is a scope and why do we care? So beans come in and out of existence while we run the program. You can see that we have an example code here of an order business service interface. And we have defined a init method and a destroy method. So these are special methods that can be called when the bean is created and then when it is erased. And so we can use both of those. So this is the SpringBean declaration. So this goes in the config file. Now, in the actual class name itself, we have this thing called the business service. And you can see that we have two different methods that are implemented here. So init is associated with the init module up in the definition. And then the other one is the destroy method, and that one's listed down below. Now, in the case that we're going to program in just a few minutes, we're only going to print these status messages. And in real life, we would use these for more important purposes. So for instance, if you were to initialize a bean, you might want to set some values. You might want to make a connection to a database. There's a lot of things you could do. As you could think, the first time that I start using, let's say, the calculator, I might want to define some lists of preferences. Now, when you're done using a bean, you might want to clean things up so you don't have memory leaks in your application. If you don't need something, then dereference it or throw it away or make it null. And so that way you don't leave extra things laying around that your program doesn't need to worry about. So more on the life cycle. So when you define a Spring Bean, you have the option of declaring a scope for that bean. So the scope annotation is to tell you how long your bean lives. Let's talk about the database service here, for instance. So when we launch the program, we would want to instantiate the database. So you'd probably want to make a connection. You'd have to give it the password, tell it what tables you're going to be viewing, or whatever. Then, during the program, you want to utilize it. And then finally, when you're done with the program, you destroy it. Now, ask yourself, if I were to make a connection to a database with a class, would I want to make that connection every time that a user requests something, for instance, searching for a list of orders or trying to log in? Would that be kind of expensive computationally to be reconnecting to a database all the time? It probably would be. So you might want to have your database connector scope to be long-lived, maybe once per session for the user, or maybe once for the entire application. You want your database connections to live as long as the application's up and running. So our utilization and the lifespan has to be determined by what the purpose of the bean is. So is the bean good for one page view only? Is it good for as long as the server is up, or as long as a user is logged in? And so there are different lengths of scope that a bean can have depending on what we want to do with it. Here's a list of them. So there's a list of singleton, a scope called requests, one called session, global session, and prototype. Now, we're only interested in really these first three up here, the singleton, request, and session. So what are they good for? So a singleton is the default for when you create a bean, and it is used for one instance for the entire application. A request is for a single page view. And then the session is, think of a session for someone from the moment they log in to the moment they close their browser. That's a session scope. So can I see the code now if you're asking for showing me the SpringBean scope? So in our config file, we're going to have a bean like this one, where it says order business service. And by default, since there is no special annotation on scope, this is considered a singleton. It's the default. If I wanted to set a request scope, I would put in the request scope annotation. This is once again in the config file. And then finally we have a session. And the session is listed here as session scope. So let's think of some specific examples of where you would use these. So let's talk about the request scope. Why would you want to create a bean that is only useful for one page view? Well, what do you think about like this example of search results? So you query a database and you get a list of jobs in your neighborhood. That information is valid for maybe just the one page view. You wouldn't want to be storing that for multiple sessions. So it's a very short-lived bean. How about this one, a session scope? You might want to keep things such as the authentication. Is the user logged in or not? Or you might want to use a shopping cart. So if you have a session in memory of the shopping cart, you keep track of everything that they've added to the cart. Now you could also store this in the database, so you don't necessarily have to use a session, but This is one way to implement a shopping cart. Or you might have something like the state of a game. We'd call this the board state. And so you can see in this example, a JSON object would be a great way to store the session of a game. You can see that the player has certain amounts of stats on him, and maybe the coordinates of where he's at, which room he's in, what's his inventory. You could keep all of that in a session. And so that would be appropriate for a user from the moment they start the game until they end the game. And so you wouldn't have to keep putting this into the database all the time. You could just store this in a session variable. Or perhaps somebody has preferences. So they have a way to update the colors or the editing preferences of an app or whatever their circumstance is. So another list of preferences might be useful for the moment the user logs in until she logs out. So there you go. That's a good use of a session-scoped bean. A singleton scope, as I referred to earlier, might be useful for a database. And so connections that live for the entire length of the application. And so singletons are by default used in the program. For example, you would say a controller is a good use for a singleton variable. All right, so let's take a look at what we're going to be writing for code in this exercise. So you can see that I have a bean definition and I have labeled it as session scope. When I run this, what happens? This particular program is supposed to show me a list of things that I want to do this summer. If I refresh the page, you can see that my list doubles and now it triples. And so the type of scope that you set up on a variable may have some unintended consequences like this one here. So let's get started and we'll very clearly understand the differences between these scopes by the time we're done. Okay, it's time to get coding. So since we're in the midst of a course here, I'm going to make a copy of the previous example. So I'm going to copy and paste topic 3.1, and we're going to name it topic 3-2. So go ahead and choose copy. Now, once we've got it copied, we need to go in and change a few things. So the first change we need to make is the topic application file. So go into your com with your name into that package, and then find topic 3.1 application, and refactor it to rename it to topic 3.2. The other change we need to make is inside the POM file. So open up POM, find topic 3-1. There'll be 2 occasions where we rename it to topic 3-2. Once you've got these changes made, go ahead and save. Now the first difference that you're going to notice is we're going to put an alert to when a class is created and when it is destroyed. So I'm going to look for the services area. Let's open up services and we'll find the interface for the order business services. We're going to start here. So open up this and you can see that this is the blueprint for 2 other services. So we have the order business service and the order business service 2. Both of these implement this interface. So right now we have get orders and test as the 2 different methods. So I'm going to add 2 more methods, one called init, which will be a void, so all it does is print things. It doesn't need to return any items. And the other is a void for the word destroy. So let's create these and push save. Now, do you see any errors occur in your program? So if you know what interfaces are, you should be looking at those other 2 classes that implement this. And sure enough, they have a red X next to them. That means there's an error in them now. So let's open up one of them and see what that error might be. So in this program, or in this class, we have a bunch of code that used to work, and now we have a problem. At the top of the page, it says, this class does not implement all of the methods that the interface indicates. So because we just added init and destroy, we have to implement those too. So let's go ahead and choose the suggestion. And when we do, somewhere on this page, we should see 2 new methods. So scrolling down, we find, sure enough, init and destroy. Now, these are only for our application testing purposes, so I'm going to print a message. So I will say, this will print init method of the order business service. And then for the destroy method, we'll say this is the destroy method of the order business service. Now, we're going to be using these 2 again, so I'm just going to copy them. And let's go find the other class that implements this interface, and it too has the same error. Now instead of just creating them manually, let's go ahead and go to the bottom here and paste in these 2 items, and we'll change the message to say 2 at the end. So pretty much the same thing for both classes. It's a status message. Now, in order for these two methods, the init and destroy method, to actually be activated, we have to put one more item into the config. So in the folder called, or into the class called Spring Config, we're going to open that up, and we see the bean definition here. So you can see that order service 2 is the current favorite of the day that we're going to be using, and we're going to add two items into this where it says bean. So the two parameters that we're looking for are called init method, and we're going to provide a string. And then the second method that we're going to provide a definition for is called the destroy method. Well, what are the names of those two methods that are in our class? Well, one is init and the other is destroy. So we'll put those in. Okay, I'm going to save the changes. And now I think we're ready to test. So let's go ahead and run this. So let's click on the title of our project and go down to Run As and choose Spring Boot App. So we run the application, and guess what shows up somewhere in the console already? It says here, the init method of order business service 2 was called. Well, isn't that cool? So let's go try a browser out. I'm going to swipe over to my Chrome browser and type in localhost, and let's go and look for orders. What comes up? So we have orders business service 2, which, as you might remember, was the junk food version of our orders. And so it appears that it's working. So if I swipe back here, I can see that the order business service 2 was called at the init method only once. So I'm going to just try refreshing this page a few times. Okay, there's 3 or 4 times. And I come back here, no changes. So this, by default, is a singleton scoped class. It's a bean that is loaded once and then used over and over again without having to be reinstantiated. Now let's change this up. I'm going into the config file here, and I'm going to add the attribute called request scope. So now the request scope is to make this bean live for only one page view. So you can see that the app restarted, and this time the init message is no longer seen anywhere. Doesn't work. Or does it? Let's go back to the app. So I've got the page open, and I'm going to refresh the app. And let's see what happened. I'm going to go back. And you can see now that it says init was called, and then destroy was called right after that. So for one brief moment, this bean, the order business service, was called into existence, was executed, and then was dumped. The Spring Boot framework didn't need it anymore. So let's try refreshing this a few times. I'm going to 1, 2, and 3 of them now, and guess what comes back in our console? And you can see that each time that I run this, it destroys and recreates the bean. Now the third item that I'm interested in is the session scope. So the session scope should last from the time that the user logs in or begins using the app until he or she is done. So let's save this, and then I'm going to restart the app, and we're looking in the console to see if init and destroy is there. So don't see anything yet. Let's come back over to here and run the page, and we've got ourselves the view, it looks like. And down at the bottom, we see that the init was called, but there's no destroy method. Now I'm going to make another change to the code here so that we can see the distinction very clear in how these different scopes work. So I'm in the class called Order Business Service 2. I want to take this list and make it part of a class member variable. So right now, it's created every time there's a get orders request. So let's choose Control X for cut, and let's move it to the very top. And so now that is a class member variable that can be accessible by any method. So now I want this to be created on the init method. So let's go ahead and cut this out, or copy it I should say, and then delete the last section. So we will define the orders list at the beginning, but we will initialize it in the init section here. So let's paste in the orders equals a new array list. So this will change the behavior of our app. Okay, let's switch back to the Spring config file. Make sure that we are at session scope. What's going to happen now? Let's go ahead and run the app. So I'm going to refresh the page, and let's check again to see what happened. So the init method was called. Now what happens when I refresh the page again? You can see that the init method is not called again. Instead, the get orders simply adds more orders to the list. And so you can see that we have a single session for this bean now. And as long as we keep choosing refresh, we get another, looks like 5 more orders in our list. So if that's kind of the behavior you're looking for, then you're in. So a session scoped bean might be good for things like a shopping cart or to keep track of if a user is logged in correctly or not. But the page we're looking at now is more like something like a search results or a confirmation page. You should display it once and then you wouldn't think about adding more items to this list in the future. So for a shopping list, great idea. For search results, kind of strange. So for this particular version, it's sort of like using a search results. So I could use the item called request scope. So I'm going to do request scope now, and you can see that the app just restarted, and there are no status messages at the bottom. Now let's come back to the app, and I'm going to refresh the page. So we get a brand new app, and we've got our 5 search results. Let's see what happened in the console. So it says we did the init method, and then immediately following that was the destroy method. So let's try that again. I'm going to choose the refresh, and this time, as you can see, the search results are recreated every time. And let's go back and look at the console, and you can see that we have multiple messages now saying, hey, I created you, and now I destroyed you, and you're only used for one page view. So there's a clear distinction between a session scope and then the same bean using the request scope. So in our example, we did something with a singleton, we did a request scope and a session scope. And we tried to show you that these were defined in different ways where you can just put in a annotation in the bean config file. And then also when you're done, think about what the goal of your bean is. Is it to show search results? Then probably use a request scope. If you're trying to use a session scope, think of things like long term, from the moment the user logs in until she logs out, such as a shopping cart, or the state of a board game, or maybe the preferences that are used for a session. And so session scope is for things that are viewed and kept between page views. And a singleton is great for things like connecting to a database or using a controller that is commonly used among all people in the app. So that's a pretty good review of what a Spring Bean and a scope is related to it. Don't forget to subscribe because this is part of an entire course, which I'll leave a link in the playlist below, that you can get an entire view of how Spring Boot works. And you can become a web developer if you do this material well. Thanks for watching, and come back to class next time.